Good afternoon. I've never been at a horticultural lecture where I've wanted popcorn more. So, I'm Bill Thomas. I'm from Chanticleer and a huge fan and longtime member of the Morris Arboretum. And I'm honored to introduce today's speaker. William Cullina joined the Morris Arboretum in July as the F. Otto Haas Executive Director. Bill's horticultural and leadership credentials are top-notch. He was, for the last 8 years, the president and CEO of Coastal Maine Botanic Garden. In the previous 3 years, he was the director of horticulture and plant and garden curator, and before that, he was nursery director and head propagator at the New England Wildflower Society. He's a well-known author and lecturer with a wonderful dry wit. His books include Wildflowers, Native Trees, Shrubs, and Vines, Native Ferns, Mosses, and Grasses, Understanding Orchids, and Understanding Perennials. But he's more than just a pretty horticultural face. At Coastal Maine Botanic Garden, he led a 20-year master plan, a $50 million capital campaign. He completed a $4.2 million net zero energy platinum LEED education center. And he grew their attendance 250%, bringing it to over 200,000 visitors each year. He's received most of the major horticultural awards given in this country. The Scott Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Horticulture, the Perennial Plant Association's highest honor, the Award of Merit, the George Robert White Medal of Honor from the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, the Award of Excellence from the National Garden Clubs of America, and he's an honorary member of the Garden Club of America. I've known Bill for a number of years. He's the sort of person who would join a local volunteer fire department. He would encourage his son to both be a lobsterman and a student at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's one that you'd like to have a lobster roll with, or even a cheesesteak, and perhaps a beer. I'm delighted Bill is now at the Morris Arboretum here in America's garden capital. And I know you will enjoy getting to know him and to hear him speak today on the critical role of public gardens. Please join me in welcoming William Cullina.
Got it. Don't turn it off yet. I don't know if this one's working. Okay. Does it seem like this is working at all? Is that? Oh yeah.
I put it on mute anyway.
Just let me know if it seems like I have to have it really close to really work. Mic me up. I don't know. Can people hear me in the back? All right, we're going to switch. Those that can't hear me, move up front. I might have to use this, I'm afraid. So I'm going to switch. All right. Well, I've always wanted to be on the big screen, and I have to say I've given hundreds of talks, but I've never spoken in a beautiful theater like this. So, and it was great to come and see, this talk in the sort of the playbill along with the other movies. That was really fun. Well, I had just accepted the job at the Morris Arboretum back in the spring, and Bob Gutowski said, "Hey, how'd you like to do this talk in the fall when you're up here?" And I said, "Oh, sure." So it didn't take long to start lecturing, but I'm thrilled to be down in the Philadelphia area. It's an area that I've come to many times over the years to enjoy the horticulture, to give lectures. It truly is. I think I've been a lot of different places, and it truly is the center for public horticulture, in a lot of ways American horticulture in the United States. And so you should all be proud, and I'm thrilled to be part of it now. But this talk came about, I think, when I talk to people and they ask what you do, and it's work at a public garden, and kind of get a blank stare. And, what is a public garden? What's the purpose of public gardens? And, I have to raise money, and I have to explain to donors why invest in what we're doing versus other causes and that sort of thing. And so this is, in a sense, is my stump speech for public horticulture and public gardens. If you don't know, there's an organization called the American Public Gardens Association, and this is the definition of that they have for what a public garden is. Nothing particularly surprising there, but the idea is it's public, of course. There's education, enjoyment, conservation, research, and the idea that it's an organization staffed by professionals. This concept of a garden, where did the concept of a garden come from? Have you ever thought about that? Back in the Paleolithic times, when people weren't eating a paleo diet, they were out in they were out in nature, right? And it wasn't, I don't think, I wasn't alive then, but I don't think that they were thinking we're out in nature. It's just you're living as part of the natural world. So this concept of a garden, of sort of kind of a stylized nature thing, is a more recent convention. I think when I think back to colonial American times, people had a few ornamentations around the properties. But most of when you think of a garden would be like a 4-square garden, a vegetable garden, an herb garden, a place where you are growing things that you want to eat that other things might want to eat too. So you're protecting those things from being eaten. But this idea of a sort of an ornamental garden, did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually exist? That's a question for historians. But this, I think the idea of gardens as a place for pleasure and ornament, in my mind, kind of grew out of the aristocracy in Europe, and this in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, this sense that you would create, in this case, this kind of stylized English landscape for the enjoyment of the folks living in the house, for the entertainment of the folks living in the house and their parties and that sort of thing. Of course, where were they getting all the money to build these estates? A lot of it came from the Industrial Revolution. And as the folks left farms and left the country and moved to the city and were working in a lot of times very deplorable kind of factory conditions, there was this progressive movement that was spawned in the late 19th century, this idea that providing public outdoor spaces and urban environments was good for the health of the workers, especially the moral health of the workers, which was sort of interesting. And so it really started this idea of a parks movement, creating these spaces that were kind of stylized nature that people get out of their sort of tenement buildings, out of the factories, and enjoy nature. During this same time, this Victorian age of exploration and imperialism and colonialism, that you had people going all over the world and collecting things and bringing them back. And of course, plants were one of the things that people brought back. And so there was also this concurrent theme of building these collections of these rare and unusual things from all over the world and displaying them to the public for their enjoyment. And you have, this is China Wilson there going out into China, bringing back plants into horticulture. And there was a huge, it would have been a great time to be alive as a horticulturist, because just the palette of plants that became available during that period of time was tremendous. And so this idea of public gardens also grew this side and also concurrent interest in the collecting and curating, researching and displaying of plants. This is the Lily House at Kew Gardens. So jump over the pond to North America. In North America, there were similar sorts of movements going on. That progressive movement was also alive in the eastern cities in the U.S. But you also had big private estates too. This is the Biltmore. And as that kind of age, the Gilded Age ended, and these estates became too expensive for people to maintain. And also, I think, out of a sense of civic responsibility, many of these estates became public spaces, public gardens. Now, if you go to Biltmore today, it's actually still owned by the family, but it's open to the public, and they have 1 million visitors a year coming. The Morris Arboretum, as you probably know, started in a similar way. This was a private estate for the private enjoyment of the Morris family. And when Lydia Morris passed away in 1932, she created a foundation, a trust, to make her garden and her estate available for public enjoyment, for the study of botany, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think that same spirit of civic good, of the importance of getting people out into nature, of providing these spaces, was really a strong current all the way from the late 19th century through the early 20th. Where I came from before moving to Philadelphia, Coastal Maine Botanic Garden, if you haven't been there, is a much newer place. This was started by a group of volunteers in the 90s and the early 2000s with some of the same goals to create a public garden for education and research and for the enjoyments of the public. But there was also a sense of an economic mission there too, of providing a place to build tourism, to build the economy of the area. When I got to Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens, I like to say I got there not on the ground floor, but on the mezzanine. We had indoor plumbing, but it really grew very, very quickly. We went from nothing to a garden in just a matter of a decade or so. I think when I think about, we obviously don't live in Paleolithic times anymore, and our interaction with nature, I think, is a lot more scripted. It's also a lot harder to accomplish. We're living in an increasingly digital age where the natural world and our world are becoming more and more isolated. And I really believe that a lot of the sort of the psychological ills that as a society we're facing today, you can trace back to this isolation that we've imposed on ourselves from the natural world, this barrier we put between us and the natural world. I think of connection with nature very much like connection with art, connection with music. If you look at cultures all across the world, just about every culture has an artistic tradition, it has a musical tradition, but all these cultures originated in places where nature was just a part of life. But now, without this, I feel like when we live in a city with no real access to nature, it's very much like saying you can't listen to music or you can't appreciate art. It's something fundamental to our humanity, and without that, I think we start to see these psychological problems that are getting worse and worse. There's just something profound about being in nature, being in color, being in light, being around flowers. Truly, some of the most beautiful expression of that is when you're in a garden where you're combining artistic expression and the natural world too. You probably heard this term biophilia. Have you heard that term? This was E.O. Wilson's coined this, and I think it really sums up what I'm talking about. It's just this connection that we innately feel between ourselves and other forms of life. This is another a study that was done basically looking at the importance of nature to psychological health. I won't read it for you, but I think you look at all the things that lower levels of depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, self-esteem, and increased capacity to gauge socially, all from just getting kids out into nature. There was a really interesting study that was just simply saying, let's look at the difference between patients that are in a hospital room with no plants and patients that are in a hospital room with a plant. And they were seeing significant faster recovery, less pain, healthier, greater attentiveness, all these things from just having a plant in a hotel room. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what does. But let's face it, more and more, I think as we get farther removed from the natural world in our day-to-day process, we we don't hunt anymore. We go to the supermarket. We don't cut down trees and heat with wood, and we're living in a very isolated world. Nature can become kind of scary. And I think I hear it all the time. I think, when you hear, I was driving down the Massachusetts Turnpike a couple weeks ago, and there's all these warning signs about equine encephalitis, which is a real disease. But I looked up, and in Philadelphia, people were talking about it. I think there's been one recorded case in the last 20 years in Philadelphia, so it's something to be worried about, but it's something not to cause a panic about. Is there a bear behind every tree? I'm going to get lost in the woods. This is a reality of, our, in a lot of ways, I think the modern American's view of nature. So to me, if you wrap all these threads together, of the sort of the history of gardens and the psychological benefit of being nature, but also a place that's safe and accessible, I think that is truly the most important function that public gardens play in American society. It's a place where you can go and relax and commune with nature, but it's a safe place. It has signs, it has restrooms, it has, hopefully no bears. But a place where a grandmother can take their grandchild, where kids can learn what happens when you pull up a carrot and see the magic of it. If you've never seen that and seen a little kid pull up a carrot and see there's a carrot attached to that plant. But more importantly, too, I think it's an accessible place. When I look at what's available to people that have physical limitations today to get out into nature, it's very, very limited. Fortunately, you might live near a park where you can access it that way. But for a lot of Americans, they don't have access to that. Coming to a public garden is the place that they can come and push around. And I think in my career, the most stories that bring tears to my eyes, I've heard of people talking about these transformative experiences they've had after an illness, after a loss, after some kind of physical disability, to be able to come and heal in the garden. It really does bring tears to your eyes. I was in Alaska giving a talk a few years ago, and the time difference there is about 5 or 6 hours from the East Coast, and my cell phone rings at 4 in the morning, and this woman is on the other end. She says, "Hello, William. I'm calling from the Disability Rights Maine. We're a consortium of 40 attorneys representing the rights of disabled in Maine." I'm thinking, oh my God, what have we done? But she was telling me that we had won an award at Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens for service to disabled, and getting to know that community and the importance that has, those kind of spaces have for that community was really impactful to me. And it really started this idea to, we hired Irene on the left there, who's a certified horticultural therapist, and we were running, now up in Maine, running 5 or 6 programs a week where groups are coming and working with her, whether they're visually impaired or other sort of issues that they have, getting out into nature, and it's been a transformative thing for them too. Why do people come to public gardens, and what do they enjoy? I mean, there's probably some obvious things. Why would they come? They want to come look at flowers, and they want to see birds and that sort of thing. But there's actually been some research done on what exactly it is that people come and enjoy when they come to gardens, which is important when you're trying to design them too. This was a study, and that was not my typo, Delaware. That was in the citation. So unless Patrice, did you correct that? But what's interesting is that that I would have thought the lawn areas and the fountains and conservatives would be the number one thing people enjoy, but it's just trees and flowers and wooded area in nature, less sort of contrived spaces to get outside and enjoy. Just looking at a pine cone, looking at a worm. What are the reasons that they want to come? The number one reason people want to come to public gardens: relaxation, stress reduction, inspiration, and then fun and social engagement, which is interesting because in some ways you might, if you're an introverted person, those two things are they don't go together, right? But it got me thinking that one of the real roles that public gardens play is a chance for communal celebration in an outdoor space, which, if you think about cultures throughout the world, throughout human history, was primarily how people celebrated things, right? You celebrated outdoors around a fire or having a feast or something like that. So where can you do that? Certainly public gardens provide a wonderful space for that. At the Morris Arboretum, for example, we have weddings just about every weekend from spring all the way into fall. And people just love the idea of ceremonies outside, of celebration outside. And again, in a increasingly isolated society, this is a chance for people to come together. I think one of the things we're all discovering in public horticulture is that events bring people to your garden. And things like this is the pumpkin village that they do at the Dallas Arboretum. We've done these sort of spooky Halloween things. Morris Arboretum right now has a scarecrow walk that's really fun. Just this idea of coming with other people and enjoying something together, rather than necessarily always coming for peace and quiet, really does tend to bring people out. How many of you have been to Longwood Gardens probably most of you, right? It's one of those, that's their busiest visitation period of the year. I've actually never gone. I would like to see the Longwood Christmas because it does look beautiful. But that idea of tradition, of being able to come year after year with family members and experience something again and again, I think is really important. In 2015, we started a holiday lighting event at Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens called Gardens Aglow, and it was tremendously successful, probably more successful than we really could handle. But what I noticed about it was that in this event, you had 4 generations in a family all coming together and all enjoying the outdoors at a time in the year in Maine when nobody really wants to be outdoors. It's cold. I was parking cars during some of these nights where it got down below zero. It's cold being out there, but just being outside, celebrating is a really important function. It can be things that are a lot more sort of true to the mission of an organization. Like this is a butterfly house that we did, a native butterfly house. People can come and have parties in there and enjoy it. This is down at Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden, the spring flowering displays that they do at a time of the year when it's still cold outside and people can come and experience the spring in an indoor space. It's not just fun and psychological health and enjoyment and social interaction that botanical gardens do, of course. Research is an important part of our role in society. And it's a role that I think is becoming ever more important as the years go by for several reasons. One of the horticultural research is a pretty broad brush, encompassing many different things, and there's lots of different kinds of horticultural research that we do at public gardens. One is just basic propagation. At the Morris Arboretum, we grow thousands of different species. We have to figure out how to grow those from seed, from cuttings, and disseminate that knowledge out to the public, to the nursery industry. Nobody is really working on the kinds of plants that we're working on often in public gardens with the collections of plants that we have. Whoops. This is the trial gardens at Mount Cuba. This basic, practical information about I plant these different monardas, which ones perform best in my area, so that when I go and as a home gardener, I can get these plants and know that this is one that's going to do better than the others. There's really nobody else doing this kind of work, and it's tremendously valuable to the public. And this is part of a larger, constant experimentation that's going on at public gardens, trying new plants, figuring out how to grow them, and disseminating that knowledge out to the public. The Dahlia Trial Gardens at Longwood Gardens was really fun. I loved going there and picking out the dahlias that I wanted to try to grow in my own garden and see which ones. It's a lot different than just looking in a magazine or looking in a catalog. Plant breeding is an area that public gardens have been very active in. Certain ones, especially the Chicago Botanical Garden, has been doing a lot of work with, especially native perennials. This is the plant breeding program Jim Alt was running with Baptisias, and really has his work on Baptisias has jump-started interest in those native perennials. So now there's many, many different cultivars that have hit the market in the last 10 years. And that wouldn't have happened without him actually taking the time to do the basic work, to try these things out, to do things that may not be economically like a quick bang for the buck that a commercial nursery would want to have before they got into this. The Morris Arboretum has introduced plants too. Probably the most successful was the pink knockout rose that came from the Morris Arboretum. I see them all over town. But blue mist, fothergilla, and some of the hardy Japanese camellias are just a few of the plants that have come out of the Morris Arboretum over the years. There's other kinds of research too. There's research and focus on the conservation of endangered flora. I was at Kew Gardens last year visiting their seed bank, which I had worked with in the past, and they're trying to basically collect and archive about 10% of the world's flora, which sounds like only 10%, but that is thousands and thousands and thousands of species. And so the idea that they can collect the seeds and then store them in long-term cryogenic storage so that something like, the American ash is a good example. When you have a species like that all of a sudden this plague, the emerald ash borer, comes in and wipes that tree out, at least you've got some genetic material, if we find a cure for that problem, to bring that tree back. You might have heard of the Wallamai pine, this fantastic prehistoric tree that was discovered in Australia just a few years ago. And that represents up there about the whole population of this species in one gorge in Australia. And through botanical gardens, seeds of this plant have been distributed worldwide, and now this plant is represented in collections all over the world where it can be grown. And this is a concept of ex situ conservation, the idea that a species may be so small in a population, so small in the wild, that having these backup populations in cultivation are there as a security in case that one got wiped out. Then at least you have that genetic material living again to reintroduce that plant into the wild. It can be kind of depressing talking about extinction and plant conservation. A lot of times I feel like plants conservation is witnessing the extinction of species, but I think there's proactive things we can do rather than just sort of sitting there and watching things go extinct. One of my first jobs out of college was working on the hemlock woolly adelgid back in the late 80s when it had first come into Connecticut. And I've watched that species move through southern New England into northern New England, down through the Appalachians, and everywhere it goes, you see, dead hemlocks in its path. And I'm thinking we have to be able to do something about this. We brought this insect over. We can't lose another species. I've watched the chestnut was gone before my time, as was primarily American elm. But you've got the hemlock, you've got the ash, you've got beech. We're really losing our eastern forest. But if you watched a zombie movie, you know that there's always survivors, right? And what are the survivors trying to do? They're always trying to find the other survivors. That's the tenet of the zombie movies. The problem is that with plants, the swiftness with which we're spreading these diseases around does not allow them to find other survivors and reproduce with them and develop resistance to these things. I think we're spreading these diseases around and insects around much more quickly than they can respond. So we have a responsibility to try to help them respond more quickly. This is a hardy or survivor hemlock up in the Delaware Water Gap area of New Jersey. Once in a while, you'll see hemlocks where this plague of adelgids have gone through, and they're surviving. Why? There's several reasons. Has to do with their inherent chemical defenses typically, or how they physiologically respond to the adelgid. But if we take cuttings of those plants and then test them, see in the white there is the adelgids, that's a resistant one in the back and one that's susceptible on the right. We find plants, seedlings that are going to be resistant to that adelgid. And if we can take those, these are growing at the Morris Arboretum, if we can take those plants, get them out to the public, get them out to schools, children, get them out to the Forest Service, and put these resistant plants back into forest systems. Hopefully, will be able to one day see that species rebound. So I think it's a really exciting direction that we can play, because public gardens have a tremendous social network. We're social places through social media, through symposia like this. We can spread the word. Look, if you have a hemlock that is surviving and all the other ones are dead, let us know, and we can propagate that plant out. The Morris Arboretum is also working on looking at other species that are resistant to the disease. This is Chinese hemlock, which is completely resistant to the woolly adelgid, as a possible solution too. Plants do move across the landscape. You don't really think of plants picking up and marching across the landscape, but they move over geological time through seed and through pollen. And you can actually trace back. It's very interesting to look at migration over time. This is a Trillium grandiflorum, and if you look at conserved genes within Trillium grandiflorum that are passed from mother to seed, you can actually trace the migration of this plant after the last ice age. During the ice age, 10,000 years ago or so, the trilliums were all pushed down by the ice to two refugia in Alabama and Arkansas. And then when it warmed up, they moved back north again and have populated over the last 10,000 years the whole Great Lakes area. And you got to say 10,000 years is a long time. But you got to remember too that trilliums are dispersed by ants, right? So the ants can only take the seeds, and they've actually measured this. The ants can move the seeds up to 30 feet a year, which is pretty good for an ant. I mean, they're not wearing the little, wrist bracelets to how many steps they've done, but that's a long way for an ant. But what's happening now when you look at projections for climate change? This is the map of Pennsylvania superimposed on the eastern United States with projections and warming. In another 50, 60 years, Philadelphia could potentially be as warm as Georgia. So the Trillium made it, that far in 10,000 years. They're probably not going to make it that far in 100. So one of our other roles, I think, increasingly is, in the public garden world, as far as research, is helping these plants migrate, disseminating knowledge about them, testing them out. Paul Meyer told me that when he first came to the Morris Arboretum, they had longleaf pines planted there, and just about every year they would defoliate, because longleaf pine is a species that grows down on the Gulf Coast, down in future Philadelphia, not current Philadelphia. But in the last 15 years or so, the beautiful longleaf pine that's growing at the Arboretum has never defoliated. It's thriving. And because things have changed, this is a plant for the future. When I look out my office window, I look across the street to the sugar maples. This looks like, this is, they're starting to turn color like they are now. Well, I took this about a month ago. These trees are sick because they are no longer adapted to the climate that we have in Philadelphia. They were planted 70, 80 years ago when they're an appropriate tree. Sugar maple, it's predicted, will probably end up in, we won't have sugar maples in Vermont. They predict another 70 years or so. They'll all be up in Canada. So what do we do? Not have trees? Well, one of the things that Tony Aiello is doing, which is really interesting, is he went down, this is live oak, Virginia oak, live oak, if you've been down to Louisiana and seen those beautiful big oaks with the Spanish moss. It actually grows, you can see the green, it grows all the way up to about Virginia Beach along the coast. And so to me, this is another plant for the future. So he went down to this stand back 7 years ago or so, collected seeds, and we're trialing these at the Morris Arboretum, and they're turning out to be perfectly hardy so far and growing very, very well. So potentially this is a plant for the future. But what about plants that it's getting too warm for, that are trying to move north? Well, we can try to do something about that too. This is Viburnum lantanoides, or alnifolium, a native viburnum. It's a northern species, although it goes all the way down the Appalachians. We went and I collected seed from two populations, one in Connecticut and one up in Maine, and we grew those side by side. in a greenhouse in Massachusetts. And the ones from Maine died from the heat, whereas the ones from Connecticut, as you can see in this close-up here, mostly all survived. And so we don't have to necessarily go down to the northern end of southern range of things. We can look at the southern end of northern plants and try to find climate adaptability. Is it really interesting when you start looking at plant migration and phytogeography, as it's called. The Apalachicola area of Florida is a biodiversity hotspot. It's down there on the Panhandle. Plants like Magnolia ashii, Ashes magnolia grow there. This is Toria, the Florida Toria, which it kind of looks like a U if you haven't seen that, but it's a species that is dying in Florida. It's not adapted to the climate down there. It was adapted to the climate in the Appalachian Mountains. But during the Ice Age, it moved down, probably with Magnolia ashii and lots of these other species, down to the Gulf Coast because it was retreating from the cold weather. The problem is it's moved down, but it's not able to move back again. And that has to do with, partly human interference, but a lot of that is just that the climate now is so homogeneous in Georgia that it really has no good climate to come through. So something that's a little bit controversial that's it's easy to propagate. In fact, it does very well in the Philadelphia area. These are growing at the Arboretum. It also does very well down around Asheville, North Carolina. And people are actually propagating these plants and then rewilding them into the forest in the Great Smoky Mountains. There's ethical issues around that. I think I'm not going to judge either way, but it's one way they're trying to be proactive in helping these plants move. If all the plants on Earth suddenly disappeared, how long do you think life on Earth would persist? It's kind of a scary thought, and there's different. I synthesized some different answers that I saw, but I came out to about 70 days. That's not much. We need plants. We all eat plants. We depend on plants in one way or another. We depend on plants to breathe. But to be able to save things, you have to understand them too. And the science of understanding the girth and depth, or birth and depth, whatever it is, of species on Earth is the science of botany. Botany is a dying science. If you look at this is a distribution of, this is in England, but it's similar to here, of in the field of biology, how many people study general biology, zoology, microbiology, sports science, molecular biology, psychology, others, and botany right here. And botany's going down. Four-year universities and graduate universities just aren't teaching botany anymore, or they're focusing on molecular botany, where you're using DNA to figure out the relationships of plants, not really getting out in the field. And I think that to basically to me, field work where you're actually going out into the woods, collecting plants, making documents, making these herbarium specimens of them, bringing them back, filing them away. It's very much like the U.S. government does a census every year or every 10 years. And why do they do that? Because they have to figure out how people have moved around. And plants are moving around and things are changing. We need to keep doing these censuses because we can't protect what we don't understand. And so interestingly, the two largest herbaria in the United States are both at botanical gardens, one at New York and one at Missouri Botanical Garden. It's a vital service that public gardens, big and small, are serving the scientific community, and one that has the academic community has usurped. The Morris Arboretum, believe it or not, was started as a the botanical department of the University of Pennsylvania. So we still have a botany department, and we're working along with all of our colleagues in the Mid-Atlantic to do this major project where we're scanning millions of herbarium specimens and digitizing them and putting them online as a tool for researchers. Well, I said we all eat plants or depend on things that eat plants. Food is something that I think public gardens have a role in too, not necessarily growing the food to feed people, but educating people about the different options they have when it comes to food plants and where their food plants come and why conservation is important in that arena too. Certainly food is a subject that really engages everybody. And if you're trying to reach diverse audiences and bring in new audiences, food is a great way to do it. When people think of food, they, primarily food plants are thinking of vegetables. But at the Morris Arboretum too, we have numerous woody plant species that are food plants too. All of these things, I think, are educational opportunities, they're engagement opportunities, and they're a way to show people how even in a small space you can help feed yourself. I was impressed. Some public gardens, this is out in Chicago Botanic Garden, have teaching kitchens where you can come and learn outdoors and actually pick the fruits and vegetables and nuts and then bring them in and then watch a chef teach you how to prepare this food. And becoming really increasingly popular. This is just one of the education opportunities available at public gardens. So to sort of conclude this, I'd be remiss here speaking to all of you and not mention the vital role that public gardens play on the educational front. Just about every public garden that I know of has some kind of educational program. And they can run the gamut, but tend to be focused primarily on plant science, botany, related fields like that. Really scientific knowledge. And when you probably heard that America is becoming dumber when it comes to science. It's actually not, we're not becoming dumber, we're actually improving, which is good. This is a researcher that's looking at scientific literacy, and over the last 25 years or so, we've actually improved, but we're still at about 28% of the population that would be considered science. So we've got a long way to go. Scientific literacy basically is just really truly understanding the scientific method, the aims of science, and not necessarily being a scientist. But I think I hope you would agree that scientific literacy is crucial if we are to sort of evolve as a society. And when I think of what opportunities are out there for scientific education outside of the university or the primary school education, there really aren't that many. And public gardens really provide a place where people of all ages can take non-degreed or sometimes degreed classes in science as well as art, horticulture, botany, food preservation, and the very few other opportunities that I could think of where you can have such a range of subjects available to you at modest cost. We'd also all agree that that it's never been more critical to connect with our younger audiences and to connect with them in a way that fosters an appreciation of the natural world, connection with the natural world. And so more and more you're seeing programs, we're working with school systems, even having preschool programs as part of a public garden where you're teaching STEM courses, science classes, art classes. Just, it's one of the most satisfying things that for me, working at a public garden is to go out on a nice day and see the school buses there and the kids just getting out of the classroom and enjoying nature and hopefully coming away with a few lessons too. It's not just learning about the plants and the worms, but I think we have a role as leaders in teaching a greater, ethic of sustainability too, because what better place to talk about sustainable practices and conservation and all these other subjects than at a place that focuses on plants in the natural world. I was really impressed when I was at the Dallas Arboretum. They have this whole science lab, and they have classes come, and the public can come and learn, and really almost like it's almost like a children's science museum type of environment, but a lot of it is outdoor. Finally, I just wanted to touch on something. Being an administrator, I have to think about money. But I think not only about budgets, but I also think about the economic impact that public gardens are making in the country, in the world. When we hosted that Holiday Light event a few years ago up in Maine, even last year, we were collecting data about where people were coming from. And this is how far people traveled to our little peninsula in Maine to come look at that Holiday Light event. And you can see we'll go out even further. I mean, we had people coming from Hawaii and Alaska to come to this, which blew my mind. But the economic impact of that is something that you can't deny. All that inflow of money coming into a local economy that desperately needed it. We employ a lot of people. If you look at the number of people employed by public gardens, I don't know, Bill, if we have that data for it's substantial. And these are good jobs. These are jobs with benefits, with professional development, with a lot of advancement opportunities. And they're jobs that, don't necessarily need a college degree either. I think when I look at the potential for jobs in the green industry and what we can do for vocational training and to get people in and trained and out and working in a field where they can actually earn a great living, it's a wonderful vehicle for developing our field and our professionalism in our field. But economic development is important too. The tourist sector here is an important part of the economy of just about anywhere. And nonprofits in general are an important part. This is in Maine. Interestingly, the nonprofit sector is the largest employer in the state. Everybody thinks Maine, you're thinking lobsters and logs, but it's the nonprofit sector. And it makes sense because basically what a nonprofit does is it takes in a bunch of money and then it disperses that money back out again to the community. I always said, because I was in Maine and we had tides, I said big tides, I said, it's like the tides. The money flows in and the money flows back out again, and at the end of the year you got mud, but it's happy mud, right? And so, it's one of the other really satisfying things that I do as an administrator is be able to foster an environment where we're building community, or we're creating great jobs for people, and where you're seeing that money have real impact out in the community. We do economic impact studies. This was one that estimated between that 10 years between 18 and 2027. We're estimating that Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens would generate $770 million for the regional economy. Just one public garden. And there are lots of them. This is a map of, sort of a heat map of public gardens in the United States. You can see there's a lot of, where blue means there's, if I can read the scale, more than 4 in an area. And obviously in the out west there are fewer. But there's plenty of opportunities to visit, to support, to enjoy, and really to become an advocate for our work, because I think now more than ever what we're doing is hugely important, and we need your help. So thank you very much.